Evening to you. If you have your Bible with you this evening, open up in your Old Testaments to Exodus chapter 19. Exodus chapter 19, that is where we're going to find a beginning place for our study together tonight as we continue in a series of studies we have been engaged in, looking at some of the highlights and major moments in the Old Testament. We started with creation. We've been working forward from there. Last time we were together, we talked about the Israelites leaving Egyptian captivity, the story known as the Exodus. And you come out of the Exodus, you have Israel heading towards the Promised Land. You have God providing water miraculously, providing manna miraculously, providing quail miraculously here in chapters 15 and 16 and 17. And while we're on our way to the Promised Land, we're not going to reach the Promised Land yet. In chapter 19, though, we hit one of the major mountains of the Bible, Mount Sinai. And it's here at Mount Sinai that something is going to happen that is going to change the Israelites, that's going to impact how we understand the rest of Scripture. It is here at Mount Sinai in chapter 19 that Israel is going to get the law. And that's what we are going to talk about this evening. So if you've got your Old Testaments with you, open up there to chapter 19. We're going to look here at the story of Israel getting the law from God on Mount Sinai. You will see various pictures of Mount Sinai. This is different from the Moses picture last week. This is actually Mount Sinai, and you can still actually see it. There are a couple of different ideas about which mountain out there is Mount Sinai, where exactly it's located. This is, for what it's worth, the picture that I think represents the biblical Mount Sinai. One thing you can notice while looking at it, you don't have to be a champion climber to get up and down this Mount Sinai, do you? Because as you're going to go through Exodus 19 through 31, if you've never done this before, notice how many times Moses is going up the mountain and then down, up the mountain and down. It's not just once or twice. Unless Moses is a champion rock climber, that's going to be an onerous task. But a mountain like this is a little bit easier to navigate. That's about 2,500 feet tall right there. I know we don't have a lot of perspective on it, but something that would have been easily climbed up in as much as you can climb up 2,500 feet anywhere easily. And you notice you've got plains around it. You've got flat land around it, which would make sense with the Israelites and their herds and everything coming up out of the land of Egypt, and the camp of Israel being able to see and observe everything that was going on up on the mountain as you have smoke and fire, thunderings and lightnings and a cloud descending and covering the top of that mountain. As you're there in Exodus chapter 19, we are chapter 19 and verse 1 at the beginning of the third month of leaving Egypt, all right? So we are 90 days after the events of the Passover. We arrive here at Mount Sinai. Moses is going to go up on Mount Sinai, and going up on Mount Sinai, he is going to encounter God there. Verse 18, Mount Sinai was all in smoke because the Lord had descended upon it in fire. And its smoke ascended like the smoke of a furnace, and the whole mountain quaked violently. When the sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder, Moses spoke, and God answered him with thunder. The Lord came down on Mount Sinai to the top of the mountain, and the Lord called to Moses to the top of the mountain. And Moses went up, and the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Go down and warn the people so that they do not break through to the Lord to gaze, and many of them perish. Moses was the only one who was called up to the mountain. Also let the priests who come near to the Lord consecrate themselves, or else the Lord will break out against them. Moses said to the Lord, The people cannot come up to Mount Sinai, for you warned us, saying, Set boundaries about the mountain and consecrate it. Then the Lord said to him, Go down and come up again, you and Aaron with you, but do not let the priests and the people break through to come up to the Lord, or he will break forth upon them. So Moses went down to the people, and he told them. Here is Moses meeting God at Mount Sinai. We're not yet to chapter 20. We're right on the cusp of it when we are going to receive the 10 Commandments from God. But Moses has gone up on the mountain. This is a frightening scene, right? We have 2 months earlier come out of Egypt. God has saved us through the Passover. We have been set free from Egypt by the miraculous parting of the Red Sea. We've gone through. The waters caved in on the Egyptians, took them all out. We've been fed with manna. We've been fed with quail. We've been fed with water miraculously. Here we are now at the foot of this mountain, and what's the scene? Something like we've never seen before. This doesn't appear to be the God who was raining down poultry and bread and bringing forth water from a rock. This is a God who is shaking the earth. This is a God speaking to us in thunder and lightning and fire and smoke. It's the same God, but there's something unique, something different about God that's being communicated here. There's something about the holiness of God that's being communicated here, and the reverent attitude that we are supposed to have before God. So you're here in chapter 20, and here's the message of God in the 10 Commandments. You shall have no other gods before me, verse 3. You shall not make for yourself an idol. You shall not worship them or serve them, for I, the Lord, your God, am a jealous God. You shall not take the name of the Lord in vain, verse 7. You shall, verse 8, remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. Verse 12, honor your father and mother, that your days may be prolonged in the land which the Lord your God gives you. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's house, your neighbor's wife, or his male servant, or his female servant, or his ox, or his donkey, or anything that belongs to him. Now in verse 18, all the people perceived the thunder and the lightning flashes and the sound of the trumpet and the smoking mountain. And when the people saw it, they trembled and stood at a distance. And they said to Moses, speak to us yourself and we will listen, but let not God speak to us or else we will die. Moses said to the people, do not be afraid, for God has come in order to test you, and in order that the fear of him may remain with you, so that you may not sin. So the people stood at a distance while Moses approached the thick cloud where God was. And then the Lord said to Moses, thus you shall say to the sons of Israel, you yourselves have seen that I have spoken to you from heaven. You shall not make other gods besides me, gods of silver or gods of gold. You shall not make for yourselves. You shall make an altar of earth for me, and you shall sacrifice on it burnt offerings and your peace offerings, your sheep and your oxen, in every place where I cause my name to be remembered, I will come to you and I will bless you. If you make an altar of stone for me, you shall not build it of cut stones, for if you wield your tool upon it, you will profane it. And you shall not go up to my steps, up by steps to my altar, so that your nakedness will not be exposed on it. Now these are the ordinances, chapter 21 and verse 1, that you are to set before them. So in chapter 21, we're getting more of the law. Let's make sure, and this is not a point without distinction, let's make sure that we understand the law of Moses was more than just the 10 Commandments, right? There was more to the law of Moses. There was more to the law that God gave the Israelites than just the 10 Commandments. The 10 Commandments were important, but there was more to the law than just the 10 Commandments. And so you start here in chapter 21, and you start to go down the list, and we see all sorts of different laws and ordinances that we would expect for a people who were forming their own nation or being formed into their own nation. We have laws about personal injuries there in chapter 21, starting in verse 12. We have laws about husbands and wives and slaves and owners and masters and things like that. We have laws about if an animal kills someone. We have laws about property, laws about all sorts of different things, all contained here in the law of Moses. Now, as you're looking here, at the end of of chapter 23, Moses is going to come down the mountain. He has been up on the mountain with God. Now he's going to come back down the mountain. And then he is going to be called back up to the mountain. So he's coming down. This is what is happening. Think of it generally this way. As he goes up to the mountain, he is receiving the communication from God. As he comes down from the mountain, he is taking that communication from God and sharing it with the people. God is communicating his law to the people through Moses, which is why we often refer to it as the law of Moses, because he is the one who is sharing it. He is acting in this mediator role, receiving the law from God and sharing it then with the people. But there's more to the law than just Exodus 20 through 23. Moses is going to make many trips up and down the mountain. Moses, as you look at chapter 24 and verse 2, God says, Moses alone, however, shall not come near to the Lord. Shall come near to the Lord, rather, but they that would be Aaron and Nadab and Abihu, they shall not come near, nor shall the people come up to him. And so Moses came and recounted to the people all the words of the Lord and all the ordinances. That's chapters 20 through 23. And the people answered and said, all the words which the Lord has spoken we will do. Now keep that in mind. He had instructed them specifically about what sin not to do. That if you know the rest of this story is going to become really important in chapter 32. No false gods, no idols. Even if it is an idol of me, a graven image, don't do it. People say there in verse 3, all the words that the Lord has spoken we are going to do. So Moses wrote down all the words of the Lord. Then he arose early in the morning and built an altar at the foot of the mountain with 12 pillars for the 12 tribes of Israel. But then he's going to be called back up the mountain. Remember this scene, lightning and thunder and earthquakes. It's a frightening scene. And as you look over here at verse 15 of chapter 24, Moses is going to go up the mountain. And the text specifically tells us that the cloud covered the mountain. So we see Moses picture looking here at Mount Sinai being on the plains. And maybe, just maybe, you could see the shadow cast by the figure of Moses off in the distance. Getting there to the precipice of the mountain, and then all of a sudden what? Have you ever been on a sports field or maybe out in a pasture when fog rolls in? And you see maybe where you're going, you see your truck, you see your vehicle off in the distance. I'm going to fight with this thing all night. And then what? That fog rolls in and what? It's gone. Right? You don't see it anymore. And it's frightening. It's a little disconcerting, isn't it? Here is the one who has led you out of Egypt. Here is the one who has led you through the Red Sea. Here is the one who has been sharing God's law with you, and now he's going back up the mountain, and the last you see of him is what? The fog rolling in over him. But imagine a fog that stayed, right? That is a horror movie, I think, right? Imagine a fog that's going to stay there and stay there and stay there. Look at chapter 24 and verse 18. Moses entered the midst of the cloud as he went up to the mountain. And Moses was on the mountain how long? 40 days. I love winter weather. I love this time of year, if we can call what we're experiencing winter weather. I'm not sure that we can, but I love it. Give me 40, 45 degrees and drizzling, my favorite weather. I know that makes me some sort of psycho. I embrace it. I love that kind of weather. And you see the little bands of rain, don't you? And you see the fog. I love that. Wake up in the morning, drive up here to the building in that fog. Absolutely love it. Flying in an airplane through the fog. Absolutely love it. Give it to me all day. 40 days of fog, I'm not so sure. That's going to start really, really messing with me. And we understand then a little bit of the trepidation that the Israelites feel here, right? For 40 days, Moses is up there on the mountain. Thundering, lightning, swallowed by the cloud. Is he ever coming back? It's been 40 days. Now we get a slight interval here. Moses is going to be up on the mountain here in chapter 24. Chapter 24 through 31 covers those 40 days from Moses' perspective. He's up on the mountain for 40 days getting the law from God. What are the people doing? Chapter 32 and verse 1 tells us the people, when they saw that Moses was delayed coming down from the mountain, they said to Aaron, "Come and make us a god who will go before us. As for this Moses, the man who brought us up from the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him." What happened to Moses? We don't know. Who's going to lead us now? We don't know. Aaron, we need you to make us a god. Which, of course, mere days or weeks earlier, they had promised and said what? We will never do this. It's a cautionary tale, isn't it? But here is the giving of the law. You know the rest of the story, at least most of us do, and if you don't know it, Moses comes down, finds the people honoring this false god. We're going to destroy the false god, grind it into powder, make the people drink it as you sprinkle it in the water. Moses is going to slam down the tablets that he got from God. God's going to give him the tablets again. And then eventually we're going to start making our trek towards the promised land. That's the rest of the story there. And you're thinking, why couldn't you have done chapters 19 through 31 that quickly? Well, we had some ground to cover. But laying that framework about the law of Moses, let's get into our final part of the study then. What's the significance for us? Why even concern ourselves about the law of Moses? Right? Because that's how we feel sometimes. Why are we talking about the law of Moses? Tyler, you know we're Christians. We're not under the law of Moses. We're under the law of Christ. We're under the gospel. So why even talk about the Old Testament? In fact, I'm sick of this entire series. I'm not coming on Sunday nights anymore till you're done with it. Okay, well, maybe that's not the best reaction to have, but consider this with me. It is important to understand kind of the timeline and the brackets on the law of Moses for a number of reasons. One reason I can think of in specific is because there has been a lot of harm done to the truth by those who would seek to take the law of Moses and bind the law of Moses as applicable on people today. Or to say that the law of Moses was never really taken out of the way, it was just supplemented, it was added to. Which brings about a lot of quandaries, a lot of trouble. For example, what are we going to do in Exodus 19 and 20 and 21 and 22 when we get all of those various sundry laws? Ceremonial laws, laws about uncleanness and things like that. What are we going to do with a lot of the laws that we find in the book of Leviticus? That becomes challenging. Do we have to get rid of all of our cotton poly blend clothing because you can't wear garments that have two different types of material in them? What are we going to do when we're growing our eggplants and pumpkins in the same patch? Law of Moses says don't do that, right? Do we need to get rid of all of that? Do we need to stop doing it? So, or as it comes to marriage, some are going to take a different view of divorce under the law of Moses. Does that mean that applies today? Can I just decide I don't like the way that my wife cooked the toast this morning? She didn't cook the toast this morning, and that's okay. She's not feeling well. But if she did, and I didn't like it, can I just get rid of her? Or maybe more applicable, I didn't cook the coffee. I didn't prepare the coffee correctly this morning, and she gets rid of me. Is that how we're going to do things? I'm not convinced that that's what the law of Moses taught, but there are some who are, and they say, well, because the law of Moses was never taken out of the way, we can do this. 4 simple principles here about the law of Moses. First one is this: the law of Moses was never intended to be permanent. Look at Hebrews chapter 8 with me in your New Testaments. Hebrews chapter 8. The first thing we need to understand about the law of Moses is that the law of Moses was never intended, and never intended by God, the giver of the law, to be permanent. The law of Moses was never intended to be permanent. Listen to the Old Covenant itself. In Hebrews chapter 8, in the midst of making the argument that Jesus is the great high priest, and we have a better covenant through Jesus that is based upon better promises and enacted by a better mediator. In the midst of making that entire argument, the author of the book of Hebrews, in Hebrews chapter 8, is going to talk to us about the cessation of the law of Moses. And he's going to talk to us about the cessation, the ending of the law of Moses, by appealing to, guess what? The Old Testament itself. In Hebrews chapter 8, if your Bible notes when you're reading an Old Testament quotation, you will notice that verses 8 through 12 is one unbroken quotation from the Old Testament. It's from Jeremiah chapter 31. Read it with me here, starting in verse 8. For finding fault with them, he says, behold, the days are coming, says the Lord, when I will effect a new, catch that, when I will effect a new covenant. Which implies that there was an old covenant that had been in effect, and what's going to happen to that old covenant? Well, look at verse 13. It's obsolete. Whatever is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to vanish away. But simply notice this point with me. The law of Moses was never intended to be permanent because God talks in Jeremiah 31 and repeats it here in Hebrews chapter 8 that there was going to be a new covenant, different, notice verse 9, different than the covenant which I made with their fathers on the day that I took them by the hand and led them out of where? Egypt. That is exactly what we're talking about, isn't it? They leave Egypt. What's the first big place that they get to? Mount Sinai. And what happens at Mount Sinai? We get the law. That was part of this old covenant. The new law is not going to be like that. The new covenant's not going to be like that. And so verse 13, when he says a new covenant, he has made the first obsolete. Whatever is becoming obsolete and growing old is getting ready to vanish away. Understand this. Number one, the law was never intended to be permanent. Whatever view that we take on the law of Moses has to recognize that the law of Moses was never intended by God, who was the author, to be permanent. It was intended to be here for a time and then be phased out, be taken away. Number two, understand then that the law of Moses was not flawed. It was good. It was not the law of Moses that was flawed. Look at verse 7 there in Hebrews chapter 8. Hebrews chapter 8 and verse 7. For if that first covenant had been faultless, there would have been no occasion sought for a second. But finding fault with them, he says, verse 8, behold, the days are coming when I will establish a new covenant. Did you notice the beginning of verse 8? Look at your pronouns there in verse 8. Who did God find fault with? The fault was not with the law of Moses, was it? If that first covenant had been faultless, there would have been no place sought for a second. But, finding fault with, verse 8, them. The problem with the law of Moses was not the law of Moses. Who was the problem with? The people. Because there was only one person that ever kept that law perfectly, and who was it? Jesus showed us that it could be done, but that we fail so often, there has to be something better. Not because that law was bad, but because we have failed. Paul's going to say in 1 Timothy chapter 1 that law is good. Law is good when one uses it lawfully. So the law itself was not flawed, it was good. So then why did God give the law? If the law was never intended to be permanent, but it was good, why would God take it away? Which is now why we understand there was so much trouble in the New Testament with the Jews who were trying to figure out should they embrace Jesus or not. You're telling us that the law was good, it wasn't flawed, but that it was never intended to be permanent. So why do I need to get rid of the law? Why do I need to embrace Jesus if the law was good? The law was good for its purpose. The law is good if one uses it lawfully, Paul said. Well, what was the purpose of the law? It accomplished what it was supposed to do. There are a few different New Testament passages that talk to us about the purpose of the law. There was not one singular purpose to the law. It helped to bring men to an awareness of sin. It emphasized the holiness of God. But one reality we find specifically revealed to us about the law of Moses is that its purpose was to bring men and women to faith in Jesus Christ. Look at Galatians chapter 3. Galatians chapter 3. We had a holiday potluck one time. I can remember this when I was a kid. Actually, go back 2 months before that. We had a going away party for someone. It was again a potluck. And we show up and we have the prayer before the meal. Then after the prayer was said, all the kids lined up. Went through the potluck line. And those of you who have seen this before know exactly what I'm about to say. What happened to the food? It was gone. And little Timmy over here, who's about 6 years old, had a plate piled with food about that high. How much of that plate of food did little Timmy eat? About a sliver of it. And then ran outside to play. Well, what has happened now to that food? Little Timmy sneezed all over it, coughed all over it, rubbed his nose. Nobody's eating what little Timmy put on his plate. What happened to all the food that was on the tables? It was gone. That next potluck rolled around, the holiday one. What did every parent say to their kids? You let the adults go first. Let the adults go first. Was there any deeper conversation there? Not in my house. It was Tyler, you wait till the adults go and then it's your turn. Was there more behind that? Was there a reason for that my parents said that? 100% there was. Were they right in saying that? They absolutely were. But did they lay down all of the specifics and reason me from point A to point B to point C to, hey, we're going to let the adults go first and then the kids? No. And that's their right as parents. They just said, hey, the adults go first and then the kids. There was a purpose to what they said. There was a meaning to what they said. Not all of it was revealed at the time. Not all of it was clear at the time. But now as I'm older, do I appreciate that? Yep. Our last get-together we had in Longview before we moved up here, my daughter, who may or may not be here tonight, picked up an entire cheesecake and started carrying it back to her seat. I kid you not. We had to stop and have a conversation about that. I will never forget that as long as I live. The point is simply this. When we tell our kids, for example, let all the adults go through and then you go through, is that good? Yes. Is that good instruction? Yes. Is that a revelation of everything that's going on? No. Is there more instruction that will be given later? Yes. Did my parents eventually sit down and tell me why we're doing it that way? Yes. Were my parents trying to teach me a deeper lesson about our stomachs sometimes not being as big as our eyes are? Yeah. If we can reason that way with our parents, and as parents, if we can reason that way with our children, should it surprise us then that God would reason that way with His people at times? He is bringing His people along, preparing them for something in the future. Preparing them for Jesus. Romans chapter 10 and verse 4, Christ is the end of the law, Romans 10 and verse 4. It's the idea that Jesus is the focal point of the law, that the law of Moses was looking forward to Jesus and His work as the Messiah. Now Galatians chapter 3 clarifies that a little bit. Look at it with me here. Galatians 3 and verse 24. Therefore, the law has become our schoolmaster to lead us to Christ. A reference back to how, in this first century context, you would have a household servant who was dedicated to making sure the children got to school, learned, and sometimes would be responsible for making sure they kept up their studies when they were back home. The law has become our schoolmaster to lead us to Christ so that we may be justified by faith. But, verse 25, after that faith has come, we're no longer under a schoolmaster. We're no longer under the law, which is completely consistent with Jeremiah 31, isn't it? That days are coming when I will establish a new covenant. The law was good in its purpose. To bring men to an awareness of sin, to emphasize the holiness of God, to bring people to Jesus. The law was good. But now it has been eclipsed by something greater. Look at Hebrews chapter 8. We just read that in verse 13. In that he says, a new covenant, he has made the first obsolete. And what is growing old is getting ready to vanish away. And indeed, if our dating of the book of Hebrews is accurate, it seems to be coming before AD 70. What's going to happen in AD 70? The Romans are going to drive in on Jerusalem and absolutely decimate the city, destroy much of the semblance of Judaism that was there. The temple is going to be in ruins. The books and the documents that they would have been keeping about ancestry and things like that, they're gone. In effect, Judaism was judged. Look at chapter 10. Excuse me. I'm on like 8 different kinds of allergy medicine, and so the fact that I've only sneezed one time while I'm preaching today is a pretty good sign. Hebrews chapter 10, look at verse 1. The law of Moses was never intended to be permanent. We've made that observation. Listen to how it's described in chapter 10 and verse 1. For the law, since it has only a shadow of the good things to come and not the very form of things, can never, by the same sacrifices which they continually offer year by year, make perfect those who draw near. The law was a what? A shadow, meaning the law was not what? The reality. But the shadow implies the reality. Right? Back here. Right here on the floor. It moves, right? It moves, not like Peter Pan, it moves by my own volition. It's my shadow. It implies the reality. The law was a shadow, implying a greater reality behind it. What was that greater reality? Verse 4, it is impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sin. Therefore, when he comes into the world, he says, sacrifice and offering you have not desired, but a body you have prepared for me. Verse 7, behold, I have come in the book of on the scroll of the book it is written, to do your will, O God. Verse 8, after saying above sacrifices and whole burnt offerings and sacrifices for sin you have not desired, nor have you taken pleasure in them which are offered according to the law. Then he said, behold, I have come to do your will. Notice verse 9. He takes away the first. He takes away the first that he might establish the second. The law, the shadow of the good things to come, taken away in lieu of something better. Verse 10, by this will we've been sanctified through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ once and for all. When did the old law go out? When does the new law come in? What we read there in Hebrews 10, 9 and 10. It's at the work of the Messiah. When Jesus does his work, the giving of the body, the sacrificing of the body of Jesus once and for all. There goes the law of Moses, which was good, which led people to Christ, but was eclipsed by something greater, eclipsed by something better. A new covenant, where I will be merciful to their iniquities and their sins I will remember no more. We have that, not through the law of Moses, but through the gospel of Jesus Christ, through the new covenant. If you've never come to Jesus Christ this evening, the language of the book of Revelation is that he stands at the door and knocks. Jesus wants to be your Savior. He shed his blood on Calvary that's pictured so long ago in that Passover sacrifice, that Passover offering. He shed his blood so that we can be forgiven. If you've never come to Jesus Christ, if you've never come to his blood and found in it forgiveness, we invite you to that this evening while we stand and while we sing.